Welcome everyone to day 2 of the conference. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I am a co-director here at the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. To start, let us acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The ancestors of the groups we are studying at this conference all arrived during the 1870s to the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis people as a part of a British-infused, Canadian-led settler colonial project. And although an agreement was broken with Mennonites over education and the wealth lost during the migration to Mexico was significant, this was also wealth gained at the expense of these indigenous groups. And we will hear later today about subsequent encounters between indigenous and Mennonite groups in Mexico, Paraguay, and Bolivia. But right now, we are focused on a panel on gender, labor, and foodways in Mexico, Canada, and Bolivia. We have an outstanding panel of scholars, which I will introduce in a second. The format will be, they will give their presentations. We have 2 scholars here and 2 coming in remotely. And then we will have a period for question and answers, and we will have questions from this audience here in the room and also questions from our audience at home on Zoom. And hello to all of you and welcome. So our first presenter is Rebecca Janzen. She is a McClelland, I hope I pronounced that right, McClelland Fellow and Associate Professor of Spanish and Comparative Literature at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. She is a scholar of gender, disability, and religious studies in Mexican literature and culture. She is the author of numerous books, including The National Body in Mexican Literature, Collective Challenges to Biopolitical Control, Liminal Sovereignty, Mennonites and Mormons in Mexican Culture, and Unholy Trinity, State, Church, and Film in Mexico. Our presenter after Rebecca will be Abigail Carl-Klassen. Her is a writer, researcher, poet, educator, translator, and activist living in El Paso, Texas. She earned an MFA in bilingual creative writing from the University of Texas at El Paso, and her work has been published widely in both Spanish and in English. She has published 2 poetry chapbooks, Ain't Country Like You and Shelter Management, and her full-length poetry collection, Village Mechanics, is forthcoming from Flower Song Press in 2023, so look forward to that. And recordings of her oral history project, which is absolutely fascinating, and I encourage all of you to check out the YouTube channel on which these oral interviews are posted. It's called Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Campos, Menonitas of Chihuahua. Our third presenter is Leidy Muñoz. She was born in a small mountainous coffee-growing and welcoming town in Colombia and grew up as part of the Berna Mennonite Church in Bogotá. In Colombia, she worked for several years with families who were victims of internal armed conflict, accompanying community processes and restitution of rights with the Colombian Mennonite Development Foundation. She is currently finishing her master's thesis in gender, society, and politics at the University of Argentina's Latin American Department of Social Sciences, and her study is part of the presentation that she will be giving. And for the last 6 years, her husband and her have served with Mennonite Central Committee in Bolivia. And our last presenter actually probably needs no introduction. She is a household name among people who are interested in Mennonites. Doreen Clausen is an anthropologist, ethnomusicologist, and folklorist who retired from the Social Cultural Studies program at Greenfield Campus Memorial University of Newfoundland in 2019. She is currently working on an autobiographical narrative among Low German-speaking Mennonite women in Mexico and Belize. So each presenter will follow each other, and I will let them introduce their papers. So let's start with Rebecca.
Hello, good morning. I'm so happy to see all of you here, and I understand some people are on Zoom even though I cannot see you. So I am very pleased to be on this panel about gender and women's work. This morning I'll be talking about cooking, but before I do that, I'd like to follow up on a conversation we had yesterday about Mennonite immigration in Mexico and land use. I wrote an article that came out of my book, but unlike my book, it is free to read. It's an Anabaptist Witness and it's open access, so you can read about conflicts between ejidos, so part of the land reform system in Mexico, and Mennonites. You can also buy my book. I can give you a discount code later. And now I'll start my paper. So the kind of work that I do, I'm a literature professor. I look at novels and short stories, and then I branched out to other examples of culture and look at these sources in a slightly different way than a historian to learn more about the cultural context in which they were produced. And so using this perspective, this morning I will be looking at two cookbooks. The first one is with Helen in the kitchen. I cannot speak Low German, and I was trying to get some coaching this morning from my two uncles, but they speak a different kind of Low German than this person, so we're just going to stick with English and Spanish. And the second is called the Recetario Menonita de Chihuahua. And both cookbooks have different audiences, different authors, different contexts of production, but they have some similarities. And so what I'm planning to do this morning is to talk a little bit about the first cookbook, whose audience is Low German Mennonites in the Americas, and the second cookbook, whose audience is anyone in Mexico who can speak Spanish, and analyze them to learn a little bit more about their context of production, specifically about Mennonite food, about Mennonite ideas of gender, Mennonite ideas of religion. So these cookbooks are obviously a bit different. The first one is in Low German. It's by a Canadian woman who first had this show on the Low German radio. And if any of you know more details than what I will be sharing this morning, afterwards I'd be really interested in talking to you so I can learn more. I listened to some of the shows as well as read the cookbook. And obviously the Recetario Menonita is in Spanish. And the woman is, the author of that one is Catherine Renpenning Semadeni, and so from her first and second last names, you can see that she has ties to two Mexican communities in the Cuauhtémoc area, Mennonites, and other groups who speak Spanish. And so the first book, the author, I believe, is from here in Winnipeg. She was born in Paraguay, and she immigrated here in 1947. She likely would have spoken Low German as a child and would have typically written in German. I'm not sure if she had written in German before this cookbook was produced or if she had mostly just spoken on the radio. I don't know who actually read this cookbook, but I have seen pictures of Old Colony Mennonite women in Bolivia speaking with the author when she was visiting them there and looking at it together. And so this cookbook is from 2007. And the radio show ran from 2004 to 2013 on what is now called Square One Media. And throughout this book, there's a bunch of recipes, prayers, Bible passages, jokes, and sayings. And while the radio show had music, the cookbook has photographs. The second one does not have photographs or any type of religious content. It does have an introduction by someone in the Cuauhtémoc area, like also in Spanish, to explain a little bit about Mennonites. And it's part of a project by the Mexican federal government to promote awareness of cocina indígena y popular, which literally means indigenous and popular cooking. Popular in this sense meaning people from a lower socioeconomic background or the majority of the people in the country. And so it's designed to disseminate knowledge about various groups in the country, and in this case, it would be about Mennonites. and is one way that the Mexican federal government is incorporating Mennonites into their national project, and to suggest that Mennonites' unique cuisine really has something to offer the rest of the country. And both cookbooks are designed to be easily used and understood, with actually fairly reasonable serving sizes and suggestions, like they're sizes of maybe 6, not 20. And my observations in large part this morning follow a scholar of Mormon cookbooks. Those of you who've read my book know that I also study Mormons, and in spite of some very different religious beliefs, the cultural practices are very similar, and in a number of places in the world, Mennonites and Mormons live pretty close together, such as southern Alberta and northern Mexico. This historian, Kate Holbrook, analyzed Mormon church community cookbooks and describes them as utilitarian, and notes that their brusquely instructional style assumes familiarity with kitchens. And if you're reading the recipes, if you can see them, that's great. If you can't, also fine. What I noticed is that all of the recipes in Low German are very conversational, which shows that they came from the radio show, then they were designed to be spoken or listened to, and since Low German is primarily a language of oral communication that most people learn how to read a long time after they have been speaking it, it makes sense that it would be done in this way. What I also noticed when I was reading this cookbook is that unlike a lot of church cookbooks that some of you may have read, and these were in German and in English, this one seems to be a little bit more specific than some of them. Like, you might know how to cook, but you might not know what do it until it's done means. There is a little bit of that in here too, but not quite as much as you can see in others. The cookbook in Spanish is also very straightforward. The instructions are much shorter, like they're just like, do this, do this, do this. And the author and the audience would have had much more familiarity with writing and reading than Funk's audience. But the recipes are still brief and to the point. And I think this straightforward communication suggests that the audience could even be using the cookbook. They're not just having it there on their shelf to look pretty. Now, the first thing that I will talk about is what these cookbooks are suggesting, like what Mennonite food actually is. And of course, this is only a very specific type of Mennonite that would be speaking Low German or about people who speak Low German. For two different audiences and kind of two different perspectives. The content is very similar. It's very heavily focused on carbs. I actually broke them down by category in the next slide. There's a lot of bread and cookies and cake. And to me, these recipes imply a history of really heavy physical labor. And so even in communities today where people who are of a Low German speaking background might not be agricultural because there is land is not available to them, the work that they do is still quite heavy. And even if family size is much smaller than it was in the past, it is still a lot of work, I would imagine, to raise 4 children compared to larger families that we saw in the first presentation from yesterday morning. And we also see the impacts of generational poverty. There's no recipe that's like just meat. And there's also very, very limited seasoning. This Holbrook, the Mormon historian, says that for Mormons, seasoning is only for celebrations, and daily recipes are more utilitarian. Mormons use this word Gentile to describe anyone who is not in their tradition. Not officially, that's not what their leaders are saying, but especially in heavy Mormon areas of like Utah and Idaho and Arizona or northern Mexico. And for Mennonites, we could think of an equivalent, like you wouldn't want to be too worldly or, show off, except then you would decorate things beautifully and people would finish your thing first and then, but that would be okay. So here's the food content of the recipes, and so you'll see the percentages for desserts and bread that math does not add up. Well, we can blame Excel. It's supposed to add up to 45. The desserts are like the percentage of the total recipes in the book, and the bread would be the percentage of the total recipes, not as a percentage of baking. But in some cases for me, it's like, well, is like a coffee cake a bread? Is it a dessert? Is it FOSPA? So what I really wanted you to take away was baking is almost half of both cookbooks, even though they're written for really different audiences, one of whom might have been listening to this radio show to try and get a new idea of something to make for their family, and the other one would be reading the cookbook to be like, who are these people who live in Chihuahua? And of course, other Mexican states, but that's the main area that would come to mind. And in both cookbooks, there's slightly different traditional recipes. Because the author of the first cookbook is from Paraguay, she has sopa paraguaya, which to me is like Paraguayan cornbread, and has pasca or Easter bread, but it's in a bun form, which we saw in the previous slide. And in the Recetario Menonita, the introduction says that all of the recipes use Mennonite agricultural products of grains, vegetables, and meat. But the recipes really rely heavily on the grains. So, and there's some traditional recipes from Mexico, or like vareniki, which are a Mennonite pierogi with dry cottage cheese in the middle, are called like empanadas Menonitas, like empanadas being a food that is different in Mexico and Argentina, but the same idea, kind of the same moon shape, half moon shape. So we can see that that this is kind of suggesting something, to me, this suggests something about Mennonites, that the food comes from a tradition of doing hard physical labor, because that is not, as far as I know, what any religious leader says is going to get you to heaven, but that and a little bit of suffering seems to be heavily implied. And even when it's communicating to someone who like grew up obviously bilingual or trilingual, speaking Low German, High German, and Spanish, or maybe English as well, as would be the case for the author of the Recetario, which would likely also mean from a different socioeconomic background, that still remains an important thing to communicate with the rest of the people in Mexico, that it's like flour-based instead of corn-based or something like that. The ideas of gender in both cookbooks I found fascinating, and like what a Mennonite woman should be doing. So this is a really cute picture from the cookbook in Low German, and there's a whole bunch of pictures throughout the cookbook of the author and her husband and her grandchildren. So we see this, that Mennonite women are supposed to be firmly grounded in the domestic sphere and are dedicated to their husband and children. There's 54 sayings or one-line jokes in the cookbook. And unfortunately, as someone who does not really speak Low German, I, of course, never understand the joke. But there's also 4 pages that are explicitly dedicated, like they're quite long, kind of a devotional, kind of a like, this is how you should live your life. And in all of these, you see like a woman should gain joy from the domestic sphere. That's not very unique to this cookbook, certainly. But what I thought was interesting was like this woman is clearly good friends with her husband and like has a particular way of relating to children, like reading to them. That's very, to me, middle class white in Canada and the United States. And that's how you know that you're a good parent. Not that people in other places don't read to their kids, but like, oh, your homework when you're in kindergarten, you have to read, I was babysitting my friend's kid, like, oh, I have to read 2 books every day. And so this is how we do it, like this is how we're supposed to sit. I'm sure the exactness is related to that kid's elementary school, but the idea that this is how you pass on your values and pass on your types of knowledge to children, not just in school, but at home, is somewhat different than the people who would be the audience for this cookbook. There's also serving suggestions that I didn't take screenshots of. Like, the pictures are all really nice, and the food looks really good, but like, they use the same napkins a bunch of times, or it's like the same plate, the same set of flowers behind different food, And so they're simple, they're clean, they're reusing things, which I think highlights values of thrift and simplicity. The Recetario Menonita doesn't have anything quite as implicit or explicit as this cookbook, but it does talk a little bit about what a Mennonite family is in the introduction. It says that Mennonite people get married young and maybe use birth control, which implies heterosexuality, and also that children would be the primary preoccupation of women. So it's much less detailed, but the idea is like, well, this cookbook is for women, and it's about what women in this other community would be doing. So that's informative, whereas this cookbook is a little bit more didactic. I'm going to skip over the religion section to start concluding here. Basically, the Recetario Menonita describes Mennonite history and beliefs, says that Mennonites have an ultra-conservative obedience to the Bible, but there's nothing kind of interspersed throughout the rest of the recipes. And maybe one of you in the Q&A time at the end can explain to me why so much of the religious content in Low German comes from the book of Proverbs. There's also prayers that are like ones that you could read along with, or if you were not comfortable doing extemporaneous prayer, perhaps could afford you some type of experience of religious devotion. And this is an example of something that I really would like to be eating, even though I had an excellent breakfast. But, you know, that looks pretty nice, but you'll see the same kinds of things on other pages. And now I'll go towards my conclusion. So, the author and the audience in the first cookbook, the one in Low German, they have a lot more things in common, even though they might come from a different kind of Mennonite, but they would at least have a language and a lot of the core traditional foods in common. The recipes, photographs, sayings, Bible passages, devotional commentary suggest that Mennonites are a pretty utilitarian group of people, and that as many other historians of Mennonite women, I would say most noteworthy Marlene Epp, have talked about like ways of finding and making beauty that would still be within the confines of whatever the particular interpretation of Christianity would be. But that also expressing this in the domestic sphere is a way that women can express their religious commitment. The Recetario, for its part, is a lot less didactic. It's not like, this is what you should do. It is more like, this is who these people are. But there's still so much in common between the two cookbooks that I found it interesting to compare them. And when all is said and done, if we draw any conclusions from these cookbooks this morning, it's that Mennonites really like dessert, and the fact that baking is the largest recipe category in both cookbooks suggests that everyone else does too. Thank you.
All right, good morning. So I'm super excited to be here today. So this is the midwifery content that you've been asking for and that you have been promised. So there is so much to be said about the history and contemporary nature of midwifery and maternal care in the Campos Menonitas of Chihuahua, and I'm just going to be very briefly touching on that today. And so the title of the presentation, Trachjmoakas. So I really apologize for my Low German pronunciation. It's not great, but really just wanting to use this particular terminology in terms of something that really can't be translated. This idea of someone who is typically a woman. Typically a particular type of woman, and we'll get into that in the presentation, but who is, working in traditional healing, and particularly this idea of like chiropractic care, or this idea of the bone setter. And then drawing from a partera, which is a Spanish word for midwife. So during the presentation also, I just love showcasing these photographs by Marcela Entz, and especially for the first part of the presentation, really getting a sense of the remoteness and the isolation that these midwives were working under. So yeah, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Do I control that here? Oh, this green button right here. Okay, perfect. Oh, look at that. And so the information in this presentation comes from two sources primarily. And so the Oral History Project, Rebels, Exiles, and Bridge Builders. And so then we've got listed here some of the different people who talked specifically about midwifery. And so I'll get into some of these people more specifically. And so some of them are featured on the YouTube channel, and then some of them opted only to have their audio and transcriptions and translations available at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. So shout out to the Mennonite Heritage Archives for the content that you can't see on YouTube. So in addition to the Oral History Project material, we were also given access to some interviews and testimonials that were done at Casa Geburt, which is a birthing center and midwifery training school in Campos 6.5. There near Cuauhtemoc. And so we received 3 testimonials that some midwifery students collected and gave to the Midwifery Center. And Katia Laman, who is the director of that center, was so generous giving us access to those and permission to use that. And then, of course, a variety of public health documents and newspaper articles, specifically from Mexico. Okay. And so you can find this. This was a series of 5 blog posts that I did on Anabaptist historians. Some of it's on the YouTube channel, and then also in a commemorative book that I worked with Pati Islas. It's commemorating the 100 years of Mennonites in Mexico. There's a chapter in there about Mennonite midwives. So, all right. So I'm going to divide this into 3 parts, and essentially it's kind of like 3 different eras within the century of midwifery in Mexico. And the first is going to be looking at 2 women who were working as midwives kind of in that post-revolution period, late 20s, 30s, and into the 1980s. And each one of these 3 different time periods of the practice of midwifery in Mexico kind of reveals a different aspect of what's going on in the Mennonite community, and then also what's going on in public health in Mexico and how the Mennonite midwives are like interacting with that system. And so I want to acknowledge that particularly in these first 2 eras that I'm going to be talking about, there are parallel systems of mestizo and indigenous midwifery happening in this region at the same time. And then there's not a lot of intersection in those communities until kind of like this last era of midwifery in the Tres Culturas region. So that's just a heads up about that. In this first section, I want to talk about Catherine Schrader and Susanna Schellenberg. And so a lot more, I think, could be said about these women who are kind of contemporaries but weren't interacting a whole lot. So Catherine Schrader was part of a Russian Mennonite migration that came directly to Mexico. There's a small community there in Cuauhtemoc, and for a variety of reasons, there are dynamics between sort of more religiously conservative and traditional community that came down from Canada in terms of these Russian Mennonites that came directly from Mexico. You know, they weren't allowed to live in the Campos. They had to settle in the city and these different things. But so Catherine Schrader, she was trained in Russia as a midwife, and then even though she wasn't allowed to be working in the Campos or living in the Campos Menonitas, she worked there extensively and gained the trust of the more conservative Mennonite community that had immigrated from Canada. And so I just wanted to touch about her briefly. She was working from the late 20s up until the time of her death. And so you'll see this with all of our midwives today, is that they are working, you know, for 60 plus years building trust in these communities. And so primarily I'm going to be focusing on, in this era, Susanna Schellenberg. And so she came down in 1927 as a later part of the Canadian Mennonite migration to Mexico, was trained by some Orthodox Jewish women in Canada as a midwife, and immediately began practicing as a midwife and healer as soon as she arrived in Mexico. And so what was happening is that immediately she is interacting with the larger mestizo community. She gains a reputation, you know, as a skilled healer, a skilled midwife, and she is being approached not only by people within the Mennonite community, but also with people within the mestizo community. And so I'd like to also note so that all of this information about Susanna Schellenberg was collected from her great-granddaughter, Susanna Thiessen, who is actually a practicing midwife and was a midwifery student there at Casa Gebert. And so the interesting kind of idea that you see with a lot of these midwives is that it is sort of like an intergenerational practice. And so Susanna Thiessen, in talking about her great-grandmother, said that, you know, she was getting into a little bit of trouble with the Mexican government. And so in this period of time, in the 1930s, there was a campaign nationally in Mexico to be building a public health system and focusing a lot on rural health access, modernization, et cetera. And so in the 1930s, there were two doctors who were practicing in Cuauhtémoc that, as Susanna Thiessen tells it, were just not having Susanna Schellenberg practicing as a midwife. And so basically what happened is that with the implementation of this public health system, you see the movement of childbirth becoming medicalized. And so this movement towards hospital birth and really kind of this movement towards childbirth being sort of like a male-centered practice in the professionalization of medicine. And so Susanna Schellenberg was actually told by the Mexican government, you are not a licensed practitioner, like you cannot practice midwifery. But the interesting thing happened is that the social capital that she had built in the community, people came to her defense. So people from the Mennonite community and also people from the mestizo community. And so I'm gonna go to this next slide. We'll go ahead and skip over this one here. And the quotation that people are really remembering is, "This woman saved lives." And so they really rallied around Susanna, and the government relented. They were like, okay, like nobody else, like aside from like these very like few practitioners, can be practicing midwifery, but we're gonna give you this like special permission from the government to continuing being a midwife. And so we're kind of moving out of this traditional healer practice of midwifery space, particularly as we're getting into the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Even though Susanna Schellenberg continued to deliver babies until the 1980s, I think. She was in her 80s when she delivered like her last child, who was one of her great-grandchildren. She was the exception rather than the rule. And so what happens is that you end up with this situation in Mexico where, because you have this prohibition on the traditional practice of midwifery, but in rural areas, there is this gap in access to medicalized birth. A lot of people are receiving little to no maternal care. And so that is kind of like a larger issue that is dealt with locally, and that also the Mexican government is taking a look at kind of in this period from like the 1940s up until, I would say, like the 1990s, like the early 2000s. Okay, and so moving into our next time period of midwifery, I'm going to talk about Agnetha Lowen Weens. So she was born in Mexico in an old colony family, went to traditional schooling up until the age of 12. And so this was in the 1960s, the 1970s. And there was, a lot of very dynamic things, happening in the Chihuahuan colonies surrounding Cuauhtemoc at that time. A lot of buzz, a lot of, electrification, a lot of excommunication. And so in the midst of this kind of tumultuous time in the colonies, she was really interested in continuing her education, but was receiving no support from her family. And so she was fighting really hard. She went to a secondary school there in Rubio, which, translates as blonde. But that's kind of like the nickname for Alvaro Obregón, kind of a smaller town about 40 kilometers north of Cuauhtemoc. But so she went to the secondary school, all in Spanish, didn't speak Spanish, really overcame so many obstacles, and decided to study nursing in the city of Chihuahua. And so she got her nursing credential, and then ended up marrying a mestizo Mexican doctor. And so it's interesting that her relationship with the, the professional medical system at this period of time. So her training as a registered nurse, her relationship with her husband, who is, a licensed certified medical doctor. And so what happened is that they decided to move into the Campos and set up a medical practice. And a large part of that medical practice was attending childbirths. And so at this period of time, you start to see this movement a little bit in terms of this hybridization of, these Mennonite women in the Campos are wanting a midwife, but also the necessity within the larger structure to have the medical establishment be part of that. And one of her big values was serving the community in Low German, giving people access to the care that they need in their own language. And so she is still practicing. She's been in a few different communities. Her husband passed away in 1998, and she just continued the practice. And I have some kind of funny stories about that. During the time that I was interviewing her, we kept getting interrupted because people would drive up to her house and honk, and then she'd be like, "Oh, I need to attend them in her little garage consult." But just doing really wonderful work and really kind of serving as that bridge between the medical establishment and this idea of a traditional healer. Okay. And so now we're going to move to the 2000s, and really within the last 15 to 20 years, you see a movement, globally, but also specifically in Mexico, towards a return to midwifery as a practice of public health, improving public health outcomes, reducing C-section rates. So this is going to be something that I'm going to talk about here in this context. The C-section rate in Mexico is very, very high, and then very high in Mennonite and also indigenous communities, up in the 85 to 90% range. The people that I was interviewing were figuring a lot of that had to do with like language access and some other factors. But so this idea of midwifery as a public health model, and then also in what in Mexico they refer to as partos humanizados, which translates as humanized birth, but it's this idea of a holistic, woman-centered healthcare, and really having midwives and doulas being an advocate for women and accompanying them as they're giving birth. So that we kind of see that movement, I would say, starting a little bit kind of 30 years ago, and then really like gaining steam kind of in the last like 10 to 15 years, particularly in Mexico, and not just in Chihuahua, but especially in central and southern Mexico. This is a model that's used a lot in indigenous communities with this model of health promoters and women public health practitioners. So I had a wonderful interview for the Oral History Project with a woman that I'd actually kind of known back in El Paso, because so she used to have a midwifery practice in El Paso in New Mexico, where she attended the birth of a friend of mine. So it was this random thing where it's I think we kind of actually already know each other. But what happened is when she was practicing in El Paso and in New Mexico, she had a lot of Mennonite clients who came up from Mexico to give birth in the United States. And she had gained the trust of these clients since about 2008. She had had many Mennonite clients, and then she was invited by a woman who was a Trachjmoaka, a chiropractor in the community. Hey, why don't you come down and give some classes on being a doula? And being, about midwifery, women are really interested in the community. And so she came down in 2015, was giving some classes, and the response was just overwhelming. And so she moved down to the Campos, and she has been there ever since, and is really into training midwives, providing culturally responsive care, culturally informed care. And so in 2016, they launched the Kasuga Birthing Center and Midwifery Training School. The last that I was in contact with them, they had graduated to classes of midwives. And the unique thing about this midwifery school is it's drawing women from very traditional Mennonite communities, Mennonite women from a more evangelical type of community, and they are very intentional about saving spaces for mestiza women and also indigenous women. And so something that I didn't mention here was that Katia actually got her start as interest in midwifery with an encounter that she had with an indigenous woman in Chihuahua, back in the 1970s. So that's an interesting story that's kind of full circle. But so anyway, I can make this available if you guys want to see those quotes and different things. So they've been graduating midwives, doulas, doing a lot in terms of public health training, things that are culturally responsive. And so really having moved towards this model of public health accompaniment, and really kind of trying to bring together the values of traditional healing and of the traditional practitioner into a medicalized context that has improved outcomes for mothers, for babies, and for public health in the community. And bibliography, all that stuff, if you're interested. So, thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a preliminary report of my research for my master's degree in Gender, Society, and Policy. During this presentation, I will speak in Spanish, but please follow the presentation in English. Este es un estudio del pueblo Old Colony en Bolivia y quiero compartir un análisis respetuoso que valora la dignidad e historia de vida de las personas que hicieron parte del proceso. Las colonias menonitas se han expandido aceleradamente en América Latina en el último siglo, como por ejemplo en las zonas remotas en el desierto de Chihuahua, el Chaco paraguayo, las tierras bajas bolivianas, la Amazonía peruana o los llanos orientales colombianos, además de otros lugares, convirtiéndose en una importante influencia en procesos de desarrollo agroindustriales y sistemas de producción de monocultivos, que a su vez están causando controversias en el medio ambiente, la deforestación y otros temas afines. Los y las menonitas Old Colony llegaron a Bolivia en una época de grandes cambios sociales y económicos en los años 50. En este momento, el gobierno boliviano suscribió un acuerdo de privilegios donde se comprometió a respetar una serie de garantías religiosas con las colonias menonitas. Los y las menonitas han pactado estos acuerdos de privilegios históricamente en cada asentamiento durante el proceso de migración. Bolivia se ha convertido en el país con mayor población de menonitas Old Colony en Latinoamérica. Desde hace varios años, el menonita David Enns ha trabajado con el apoyo del CCM y otras personas en recopilar en un mapa la ubicación de las colonias menonitas en el país. Para el 2002, habían 42 colonias. 13 años después, en el 2015, aumentaron a 75 colonias. Y en el 2019, habían 106 colonias en Bolivia. Un aproximado de 100.000 habitantes menonitas, distribuidos principalmente en el departamento de Santa Cruz en Bolivia. En la actualidad hay información limitada en español de los y las menonitas Old Colony en Bolivia. Los datos de las colonias son incompletos y poco confiables. El gobierno boliviano hace un mínimo esfuerzo por prestar atención a este grupo social e ignora las problemáticas o necesidades como la pobreza, violencias, discriminación que viven y enfrentan. La información principal existente de las colonias menonitas se enmarcan especialmente en asuntos agrícolas y en el rol proactivo en el desarrollo tecnológico y económico del agro boliviano. Este es un tema fundamental para el país, y los y las menonitas han tenido un rol activo en el desarrollo de la economía nacional. Desde el lente de género, este estudio hace un análisis para la comprensión de las realidades de una visión más profunda de las condiciones de vida de los y las menonitas Old Colony. Especialmente se abordan temas como género, interseccionalidad y poder. Uno de los aportes centrales de este trabajo es que logra superar las barreras culturales de idioma, distancia geográfica y el desconocimiento de la organización social que constituye a las colonias menonitas. Todas las entrevistas estuvieron acompañadas por Judith Brown, trabajadora de servicio del CCM en Bolivia, quien acompañó con la experiencia en la cultura y en la interpretación. Al ser las colonias menonitas una cultura tan diferente, con un sistema cerrado en sus marcos religiosos y normativos, hay una suposición de las demás culturas que los rodean acerca de cómo deberían ser ellos y ellas, según la sociedad y la cultura dominante. Es decir, existen prejuicios y estereotipos muy arraigados y difíciles de erradicar, basados en una mirada etnocentrista. Las colonias menonitas, por su parte, tienen una organización estricta que impide la exploración y profundización de las dinámicas complejas al interior de sus espacios sociales y defienden la premisa de no aceptar el mundo moderno que limita el entendimiento de otras culturas. Estos estereotipos y prejuicios categorizan a los y las menonitas y limitan la comprensión o entendimiento de su cultura. En Bolivia hay varios ejemplos de exclusión, estigma y discriminación a partir del desconocimiento de una cultura. Los prejuicios han dictado normas, patrones y conductas, incluso de relacionamiento. Este proceso de investigación ha construido un diálogo intercultural. En cuanto al estilo de vida, los y las menonitas Old Colony mantienen un modo simple de vivir, de acuerdo con su comprensión de la Biblia. El uso de teléfonos, reproductores multimedia, vehículos de motor, neumáticos de goma en tractores y otros se consideran innecesarios para una vida familiar y comunitaria plena y por lo tanto a menudo se prohíben. Las colonias tienden a aislarse de lo que llaman el mundo, adhiriéndose estrictamente a las reglas destinadas a preservar los distintos límites de la comunidad. Los y las menonitas Old Colony conservan el estilo de vestir caracterizado por overoles y camisa de cuadros en hombres y vestidos largos, principalmente en colores oscuros para las mujeres, además de sombreros. Las mujeres menonitas son las encargadas de elaborar la vestimenta de todos los miembros en la familia. La comprensión de la colonia Old Colony acerca de la unidad requiere principalmente que los y las miembros de la comunidad y la iglesia tengan las mismas creencias y costumbres, que los definen como un grupo distintivo. Cambiar una costumbre o regla a menudo causa desunión, e incumplir las reglas pueden acabar con la expulsión o como comúnmente los y las menonitas conocen como excomunión. Desde la infancia se preparan para la vida en la granja, aprenden habilidades ayudando a diario en tareas diversas. Como resultado, se hace menos hincapié en la educación formal. La mayoría de los varones en las colonias hablan varios idiomas como alemán alto y bajo, español o inglés, mientras que la mayoría de las mujeres están limitadas al alemán. Mujeres anhelan aprender otro idioma para comunicarse por sí mismas, profundizar en temas, acceder a servicios sin intermediación de la figura del hombre. Ellas asisten al médico en compañía de los esposos o padres cuando son menores de edad. No tienen privacidad y mucho menos autonomía para tomar decisiones, ni siquiera de sus propios cuerpos. La iglesia es fundamental para la vida en las colonias. Notablemente, en las colonias impera una cultura androcéntrica en la que el hombre, sus intereses y sus experiencias son el centro. Además, la organización interna está liderada por jefes religiosos elegidos de por vida, todos varones con el poder de mantener reglas y tienen la palabra sobre temas de fe y la vida de la colonia. Hay también líderes cívicos, elegidos por periodos para representar asuntos civiles. Estos líderes son responsables de mantener la ley y el orden en la colonia y lidiar con la mayoría de las disputas sin involucrar al sistema de justicia boliviano, aunque varios de los temas como violencia doméstica, violencia sexual, salud mental, alto consumo de alcohol y drogas en los últimos años han involucrado a las autoridades bolivianas, pero los graves hechos dentro de las colonias no tienen mayor atención del Estado. En las elecciones de nuevos líderes dentro de las colonias, únicamente participan los varones bautizados. Las mujeres no tienen voz ni voto en este aspecto, mucho menos para ser nombradas en algunos de estos roles. Por otro lado, líderes jóvenes que asumen el rol de liderazgo se presentan más conservadores. Se afianzan en mantener la rigidez en las reglas y resistirse a los cambios. Continúan en el aislamiento fundamentados en un estilo de vida simple y en ocasiones son más severos en la toma de decisiones en el ámbito comunitario. Hay muchos casos de excomunión en las colonias Old Colony y varios de ellos tienen un gran temor al último y desafortunado paso para cerrar las puertas del reino a los desobedientes. Fue conmovedor escuchar los esfuerzos para seguir conectados de alguna forma con miembros en la familia a pesar de estar lejos. En las colonias solo se reconocen dos sexos y géneros, y para estos mantienen roles estereotipados y tradicionales tanto para las mujeres como para los hombres. Existe una naturalización de los roles femeninos en el ámbito privado, conocido como lo doméstico y familiar. En cambio, lo masculino en el ámbito de lo público, es decir, el poder económico, político, religioso e incluso social. Las comunidades menonitas Old Colony establecen en las mujeres las funciones tradicionales de reproducción, el cuidado de otros y otras, y labores domésticas, quedando en responsabilidad de los varones la tarea de producción, liderazgo y economía. Y pese a que actualmente una parte de las nuevas generaciones desafían los cambios de la modernidad, trae consigo, sin embargo, se mantiene una firmeza en la organización patriarcal dominante e insisten en mantenerse alejados del mundo, aunque hay una tarea que por lo general reúne a hombres, mujeres, niños y niñas y es ordeñar sus vacas, que es la base de la economía familiar. Escuché varias familias Old Colony jóvenes optando con tener menos hijos. Los hombres siempre atribuyeron esta opción con los problemas en la obtención de tierras y en la voz de las mujeres comentaron los problemas de salud física y mental, la carga doméstica y algunos nos permitieron saber de los casos de violencia obstétrica en hospitales de la ciudad y los impactos que ha dejado en ellas. Presté mucha atención a la queja continua acerca del incremento de los problemas de salud mental, la ansiedad, la depresión, las pérdidas, los niveles de soledad, de angustia, se desbordaron en la pandemia. Y lo más difícil de este tema es que muchas de las personas en las colonias Old Colony en Bolivia no tienen servicios cerca y menos en su idioma. Esta es otra barrera para las mujeres y es una problemática que afecta a las personas en todas las edades. También fue frecuente escuchar la preocupación entre las familias por los jóvenes en las colonias, especialmente por el uso de alcohol, drogas, mascar coca, uso de la violencia y otras dinámicas que van en contra de los valores. Durante las visitas a las colonias, les dio más confianza a ellos cuando yo estaba acompañada de mi esposo. Esto dio un mensaje de compromiso y abrió las puertas al diálogo. En cada sesión fue común ir las mujeres a un lado y los hombres al otro. Es el mismo modelo que siguen en la escuela o en la iglesia. En los espacios sublimes entre mujeres se logra una apertura y libertad genuina para la conversación. Podíamos abordar casi cualquier tema de la cotidianidad de sus vidas. El periódico Post y la revista para niños Das Blatt del CCM son el medio de información más relevante en las colonias menonitas en Bolivia. Las familias animadas hablaron acerca de las noticias internacionales, las cartas de personas que están publicadas allí y la nota del editor. El Das Blatt se está utilizando en algunas escuelas de las colonias como parte del currículo escolar semanal. A causa de la controversia con aparatos tecnológicos y electrónicos dentro de la colonia, implementamos únicamente un diario de campo para el registro de las notas y no el uso de la grabadora, principalmente por respeto a la comunidad y mantener un espacio de confianza. En el proceso se obtuvieron 10 entrevistas, que incluyen 7 mujeres y 9 hombres. todas personas casadas, entre el rango de edades de 25 a 65 años. Las entrevistas se llevaron a cabo en 5 colonias All Colony, ubicadas en el departamento de Santa Cruz, a una distancia de 2 a 8 horas de la ciudad. Un buen porcentaje de personas entrevistadas han experimentado la migración, al igual que sus antecesores, y otros y otras nacieron en territorio boliviano. Gracias.
Appreciate this technological revolution that we can bring in speakers from all over the place. This is wonderful. Why don't you sing a song? Where's the conductor when we need one?
Sorry, folks, the share screen isn't working. So I think I'll just talk. Okay, today I assume, can you hear me? Okay, today I once again assume the role of a storytelling grandmother as I explore the identities Low German-speaking Mennonites created for me during my research in Mexico and Belize. The week before I left for doctoral research in Zimbabwe in 1992, a South African grad school friend asked why, since I knew Low German, I wasn't going to South Africa to study Afrikaans storytelling instead of researching Shona language storytelling in Zimbabwe. I asked myself that same question again and again, particularly on challenging days in Zimbabwe, and resolved to use Low German in future research. The first opportunity came in 1994, when Abe Workington, editor of Die Post, a periodical published in Steinbach, Manitoba, needed someone to conduct interviews on Mennonite migration from Manitoba to northern Mexico in advance of the 75th anniversary of that migration. The deal was, Abe wanted me to drive a 5-speed VW Jetta to the Cuauhtémoc region for MCC workers to use after I finished my 2-month stint as a researcher, but I bargained to have MCC purchase a $500 Uher cassette recorder, which I would use to record interviews and would then leave the recorder in Mexico for use by the local historical society. Also part of that deal was that Abe wanted me to conduct a workshop on oral history interviews with the local Mennonite Historical Society. For that workshop, MCC worker Roosevelt Fast and I prepared a how not to conduct an interview conversation, and chose as our topic how Mennonites started planting apple orchards. Since I hadn't been able to drag that information out of any of my interviewees. As it was a mock interview, Rose Bell and I invented a rather fanciful story of how Mennonites started planting apple orchards. But a committee member, assuming that we were serious, interrupted us and told us the whole true story. Not only that, after the workshop, he said, "You have to come interview me because I bought a pickup truck, got excommunicated, apologized to the church, returned the truck to the garage over the next and dag für mig dat light. The next day I regretted it and brought the truck back to the garage, or bought the truck again, drove to the elder's house again and said, I bought back my truck, do what you like." And the elder said, "Well, you've apologized to the church," and they never bothered him about it again. And he said, now everyone drives a pickup truck. I also recall that this interviewee had told me they would serve me Mennonite food. So I expected farmer's sausage, pierogies, and plumemos, which the Betty Crocker cookbook mistakenly calls Swedish fruit soup. But when they served tortillas and refried beans, I asked, "Is this Mennonite food?" And the man said, "Yes, we eat this all the time, and we are Mennonites." Apart from the questionably called Mennonite food, I thought, that's how interviews were supposed to go. Someone had a story to tell. I listened, and then I, as a designated researcher, asked questions. But that's not how it always turned out. I made subsequent trips to Mexico and Belize between 2010 and 2014, but in that summer of 1994, I naively assumed that since my paternal grandparents had been members of Rose Farm Church, a conserving Mennonite church near Low Farm, Manitoba, and my paternal grandmother had only about a grade 3 education, I could easily slip into this culture. With the assistance of MCC workers Roosevelt Fast and Abe Janzen, and by hanging out at the Altenheim, I was able to conduct the 25 interviews Abe Workington and I had agreed on. But I also looked for opportunities to be part of the community, church services, funerals, auction sales, and a verlofnis, an engagement party conventionally held at the bride's parents' home the Saturday before a couple's wedding. The young married woman who garnered my invitation to the verlofnis offered that I could borrow one of her dresses so that I could fit in. It was an attractive bright purple, and as I'm sometimes called the woman with the purple hair, I ignored the fact that it was a heavy fork-trowel dress, much too warm for a summer's day. I also ignored the fact that the young woman was a size 14 and I only a size 6, as I knew the dress would be long enough to be modest and I could keep it in place by tying the apron rather snugly, as aprons were still worn over dressy dresses in that colony in those days. So I went to the verlofnis that Saturday afternoon, assured that I would fit in. When I arrived at the celebratory home, those who greeted me ignored the fact that I was dressed as a 20-something young married woman, like the young women preparing to serve food, and offered me a chair with the other late 50-year-old gray-haired women seated in the shade of a large tree. My A-line woolly purple dress was no match for the satiny, narrowly pleated dark green, dark maroon, and navy dresses seated around me. But the women graciously welcomed me into their conversation. With no husband or children to complain or brag about, nor any laudable domestic skills, the talk turned to my research in Africa. As someone had heard me interviewed on the radio by Bram Siemens. Not surprisingly, they asked the question I've heard everywhere I've chatted with women. Do women in other countries have to work as hard as we do? So I told them about the rural Zimbabwean woman who said, look at me, a baby on my back, another in my tummy, a hoe on my shoulder. I've worked in the fields all day, and now I have to cook supper for my husband, who's been sitting outside my hut all day, making important decisions. I didn't have to explain that example, as the women very easily understood asymmetrical gender relations. However, the age-inappropriate purple dress also freed me from some expected age-appropriate behaviors. So several youth decided that I was a suitable candidate for visiting what they call the smoking room for the youth. And a smoking room it certainly was. Smoke so thick I couldn't see across the room, just as in my grad school days in anthropology at U of Manitoba in the 1970s. Smoke and freely flowing alcohol. But the youth explained they'd invited me in before they started getting drunk, as I should also know about youth culture, at least theoretically, but didn't need to see them drunk. My name Klassen evoked numerous local attempts to establish my linkage with Low German Mennonites in both Mexico and Belize. Klassen, after all, is a familiar enough Old Colony family name that surely I must be related to their Klassen relatives. So out came the family genealogy books, and as they paged from Klassen family to Klassen family, my host tried to ascertain which Cornelius Klassen was my grandfather, although his name didn't sound all too familiar, and whether his son Abe, my father, was Tina's Abe, or Susie's Abe, or maybe Mary's Abe. That was reasonable, but when the two middle-aged women who'd taken over their parents' farm used their genealogy book to take over my so-called interview with them, I realized that I was no longer the researcher. In fact, every time I tried to answer a question, I was interrupted by their comments and questions. I doubt that I even uttered one complete sentence in that so-called interview. It was only in retrospect that I realized I could have listened to how they, as independent single women farmers, framed issues of gender, for example, as they discussed familial relationships. But at the time, I was merely frustrated about not managing to ask a single question, while they created my Klassen genealogical linkage. But genealogy books also pointed out one of my cultural blind spots. In fact, it was when a Mrs. Klassen's daughter showed me the substantial family record book she had compiled that I noticed another one of my purple dress faux pas. She said, for each family member, I list the birth date, the date of baptism, the minister who baptized them, their date of marriage, their spouse, their children, and so on. And I realized that I hadn't collected any baptismal data, possibly because in the late 1950s, I wasn't particularly fond of ministers and had felt forced to be baptized in order to become the church pianist in a Mennonite Brethren church. More importantly, upon reflection, I realized that I, as an anthropologist, had missed one of the most important rites of passage for Old Colony youth, baptism, and officially joining the church, the official declaration of adulthood required in order to be married in the church. So if I wasn't in Mexico or Belize to find my long-lost Klassen relatives, why was I there? I explained to women that I was interested in their everyday life experiences because women's lives are often not part of the stories we tell about migrating Mennonites. Books and newspapers tell us about a group of men who travel to a faraway country in search of a place where a farming people could live separately from the world. These men would travel by public transport, dine with presidents and other politicians, but presumably changed their clothes at least once during the 3 weeks that they traveled. However, the published reports never told us who had sewed the men's clothes, washed and ironed them, packed the men's suitcases, and laundered everything when the men returned home. The women I spoke with agreed that their part of the story had been omitted and needed to be told. They often expressed a regret that I had no children, a regret I don't share, but strongly affirmed that by having the freedom to travel and collect women's life stories, I could help include women's lives in Mennonite stories. Feels dat es wichtige Arbeit, because collecting women's life stories was important work, or literally work with weight or of substance. Many a time I would visit with women at seniors' homes. They had time to visit and often welcomed having an interested listener. However, on May 29, 2010, I wrote my friends in Canada about another research experience, probably one of the most unusual experiences in my 45 years of fieldwork. I had already been welcomed into 2 seniors' homes in northern Mexico when I decided to visit a third home. On my first visit, I was welcomed, invited to join women chatting in a lounge before the evening meal, and invited to stay for the evening meal. During the meal, I asked the women at my table if I might take a photo of them, and they appeared to indicate this was acceptable. But after the meal, all of them disappeared. So I went to the room of the woman who had been most inviting. Her battery-operated wheelchair and expensive clothing suggested to me that she was not only wealthier, but also more open to new ideas than others in the home. This was unlike a minister about whom the women had said, "We shouldn't laugh so loudly or he will be upset." But this woman had said, "I'm trying to cheer them up by getting them to laugh." We had a good chat, and I returned a week later since I had told the women I was writing a book about women's life experiences and would like to speak with them as well. When I returned to the home the following week, I was greeted by the male administrator who told me, "You have to give me your bag. You made a movie and showed it on TV, so you have to give me your bag." Knowing there was no truth in his assertion, I refused, and I explained that my university would not allow me to conduct research on the sly, that I had not made a movie, nor would I record anything unless given permission. I returned to the, I returned to the room of the woman whom I had visited the previous week, but she was eating her afternoon lunch and didn't even look up to greet me. Soon the wife of the administrator entered the room and looked at my bag, which thankfully was closed and on the floor. She exchanged a few words with the woman, then left. And I was now able to begin a conversation with the woman. No sooner had we begun than the male administrator appeared again and said, "You have to go now. This woman's daughters called me and told me that you are a dangerous woman." When the administrator left the room, the woman said, "My daughters didn't call him. They would never say such a thing. You'll have to go, but I'll go to the door with you in my wheelchair. These people don't know better. You have to forgive them." Since this is a community that shuns those of whose behavior they disapprove, I was tempted to say she needn't accompany me, but she did, and took me right to the door, past a circle of about 10 women who just stared at us. And the story of the Good Samaritan certainly came to mind. I can only hope there were no negative repercussions for the woman who hosted me, as she was certainly a gracious, compassionate, insightful woman. Returning to my apartment after this encounter, I was tempted to share the good news of my designation as a dangerous woman, but decided against it, as this was also a community in which gossip was rife, and I was curious to know how widely the story of my being kicked out of a seniors' home would circulate. So I said nothing to anybody. Several days later, I visited the most liberal of the other seniors' homes, and the female administrator greeted me with the words, "You are always welcome here." Had she heard? I didn't ask. But when I went to visit my favorite interviewee, she asked if my tape recorder was turned on in my bag. I responded saying it was not, and reminded her that I had always asked permission each time I had tape recorded our conversations, and she affirmed that this had been the case. Whether or not my excommunication as a dangerous woman had reached this other seniors' home, I will never know. But it did not jeopardize future research. But I always wondered what negative repercussions there might have been for the woman in that home who had befriended me. I left her seniors' home with a better theoretical understanding of social exclusion in her cultural context, but she had to stay and live with it. Primatologist Jane Goodall incidentally says, "It doesn't take much to be considered a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us." But I was not only dangerous. Apparently, as another attempt by a Mennonite man to define my identity will reveal, I was also misguided, and perhaps also not a responsible Mennonite. It was on an exceptionally hot summer's evening in 1994 that several elderly women, an older, somewhat deaf man, and I were sitting on a patio outside a Mennonite seniors' home. The man had plastered me with questions concerning what I taught at university. Do you teach them about Mennonites? Do you teach them the catechism? Do you teach the Bible? And so on. My attempts at explaining the differences between proselytizing and cultural relativism seemed futile, not only to me, but also to this man. All of a sudden, he got up, looked me in the eye, and said, "You must be at least 85. He left, and when we had finished laughing, 90-year-old Sarah explained, "It's because of your gray hair. All the women under 85 dye their hair, usually with coffee." She continued, "I wouldn't dye my hair because the white hair grows back, and then you have this strip down the middle, and you look like a skunk." Fortunately, this event opened up the way for further conversations concerning women's hairstyles, headwear, and other clothing, often surprising me with concerns about proper attire, but especially with using this year's fabrics amongst a group supposedly known for their humility and apparent disinterest in personally distinctive appearances. So I'm a dangerous woman. I'm not related to the right sort of Klassens, and I'm misguided and irresponsible about what I teach at the university. So what's the point of my research amongst Low German-speaking Mennonites, and particularly amongst women? Two women in particular helped clarify that for me. When I asked one of my older widowed interviewees how it helped her to retell the story of an abusive marriage, I'd heard the story 2 or 3 times, she said, "Every time I get to tell my story, my heart gets a little lighter." Another woman also reminded me of the importance of telling women's life stories. One afternoon, her husband regaled several of us in their home with a story of how the male leaders of their community had gathered fabric and treadle sewing machines, which were no longer used in the village, as they now used electricity. The men were able to take truckload of these sewing machines to a colony that did not use electricity, and had lost everything through a hurricane. As he spoke with pride about the generosity of these men, his wife, who was standing across the room, folded her arms defiantly in front of herself and said, "En du vroeg me niet of ik met vol." You didn't even ask me if I wanted to go along. And that's why I feel compelled to continue being a dangerous, misguided, irresponsible woman, to tell the story of those who are not even invited to be part of the story, let alone to tell their part of the story.
Well, thank you to all four panelists for wonderful stories about many misguided and dangerous women. I think we all proudly would like to bear that badge like Doreen. So we are going to have about 20 minutes for questions, and just remind you we have Rebecca, who spoke about comparative Mennonite cookbooks, Abigail, who spoke about midwives, Leidy spoke about the experiences of Mennonite women in Bolivian colonies, and Doreen, who reflected on the lived experiences of women through her research. So we'll open up for questions. Kate has the mic. So just raise your hand and Kate will come to you. And please introduce yourself before asking your question. And for those of you watching by Zoom, please type in your questions and we will get to those as well.
Thank you for these presentations. Maybe more of a remark to what Lady Muñoz has presented. I'm Patrick Friesen. I come from the Menno colony, and we see a lot of big influx of Mennonites from Bolivia coming to our colonies in the central Chaco. And in reference to what you spoke about, I find those are mostly young families looking for opportunities and looking to get away from their communities, if I may say so. And my question is that somehow reflected in your research? Que muchos menonitas salen de Bolivia hacia el Chaco Central.
Gracias por la pregunta y voy a apoyarme de Natán para la traducción.
Thank you for the question, and I'll go ahead and translate.
Sí, la investigación también provee algunos de los escenarios de familias jóvenes saliendo de las colonias Old Colony.
The investigation did show some examples of young families leaving the old colony.
En la experiencia que tuve con las entrevistas, reconozco que escuché varias de las familias saliendo.
In the interviews that I had, I recognized that some of the young families were leaving.
Pero también hay que decir que muchos también tienen preguntas acerca de si salen, cómo perder la garantía de estar en el reino o en el cielo.
But also that some of those families were asking if they would leave, they would lose the structure and using the idea of leaving the kingdom of God.
Y muchas familias jóvenes todavía tienen mucho temor y respeto de la excomunión.
And many young families do have a lot of respect for the structure and the fear of excommunication.
Gracias.
Tina Fair-Kaler. Of course, you knew I was going to say something, right? I found all of them very fascinating. So I have several statements, questions about everything, everybody's, I think. Have you seen Trachjmoakas, Manitoba, the YouTube channel?
What is this? Tell me
So
more.
this is a Mennonite man who has roots in Mexico who gives talks about how to cook. And he does this on his property in southern Manitoba in the RM of Stanley. And most of his cooking is like it's on disco, it's on like barbecue, and a lot of it is vegetable and meat based. So it's like main meals, which I find fascinating. And he has 18,000 views of each of his videos.
Wow, I've watched a lot of like dicha videos on YouTube, but I've not seen any on cooking. Like really good ones. This person did many good ones. Very cool.
Oh, right. Okay, you don't understand Low German, right? Okay, it's
No,
in,
you
it's
can
in
put,
Low, it's in Low
okay.
German.
I can kind of understand it, and I'm just more curious, like what people are communicating about what Mennonites are eating. Like when I have eaten with people in Mexico, like they're cooking all kinds of food, not necessarily what's in here. Like when I was in Paraguay, they don't just make like one Paraguayan dish.
Right.
And it's like obviously a combination of what other people in the surrounding region make, and to quote one of my relatives, like we don't put quite as much spice in it, but like it still is compared to even like a Canadian version of Mexican food, like it's really spicy. Or so
Right.
yeah, I had not seen that in any of the other things that I read from communities from Paraguay or Mexico who would be like writing more and publishing more, or here in Canada. That's really cool.
Yeah, it is very cool.
Yeah.
And they're using a lot more chilies and that sort of thing. And you know, has there been research done on like Mexican Mennonite food? So like, I don't know, but that would be fascinating because like in Winkler where I live, there are a few restaurants and they all serve Mexican Mennonite food, which is not really Mexican, right? Because like we also have a Mexican restaurant in town which serves Mexican food, which is not Mexican Mennonite food.
Well, and then there's like the food that gets exported back. I have a friend who's a prof at Cal State in Fresno who's from Nuevo Ideal, Durango, like the town, so not the colony. And he's like, well, Mennonite food's delicious. Like they have hamburgers. And I'm like, okay, that's what got brought back from people who travel back and forth?
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
I mean, no knocking that. I
Hamburguesas.
like them.
Oh yeah, they're great.
But it's so...
Pizza.
Yeah. I was hoping one of you actually might know if anyone had written about that, or like on Low German Radio if anyone had talked about that, or I guess a YouTube channel is what's
Yes.
happening. Cool.
That's where it's happening. I also have had a theory about why there is so much baking in cookbooks. And so the Low German word for like baking sweets is Scheinit. So it is like, there's always a question of, hast du was Scheinit, Matt? Like, have you brought a dessert or a sweet along anywhere? And so, and I have my theory is that it's because it's sugar, and so that makes people happy. And Mennonite moms want to make their children and grandchildren and partners happy. That's my theory.
I mean, that just seems like a human thing, honestly.
Right? Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, anyways. Abigail, thank you so much for that. Fantastic. So, have you heard? Katia's podcast?
Just a little bit, but yeah, no, Katia is wonderful and fascinating and doing all sorts of culturally competent work and really drawing in everybody in these really fascinating ways. And yeah, I would recommend that podcast. That's amazing.
Yes, I would recommend it too. It's fascinating.
Like
and
American Midwife in Mexico,
yes,
I think
that's
it's called.
what it's called. Yeah. Unfortunately, there are only like 2 episodes or 3.
Yeah, no, because
So-
she's a very busy lady.
Yes, that's what I figured. Yeah. So to anybody who wants to hear more about her work in Mexico, just look it up. It's awesome. So your comment about Agnetha Lowen-Weens being the only official midwife, and knowing that my grandmother was a midwife. I'm thinking there's probably a lot of underground midwifery that is happening.
Oh, yeah.
The same as it was here in Canada before it was legalized as well.
Absolutely. So the way that I look at this research was just sort of like scratching the surface, and I was anticipating like a lot of people responding like with family histories or with that knowledge that like needs to be explored. And so like I'm just super excited that this is cultivating those conversations.
Yes, totally. Me too. I tell my husband all the time, if I ever talk about getting a PhD, just shoot me. Just like don't let me do it. But that really fascinates me. And you talked about like C-sections, right, being very predominant. And so in my work with MCC over the years, like I spoke to a lot of women, and they talked about all the C-sections that they got, and I'm like, what is going on here? So I'm a researcher. I dig into things. And from what I understood from what people were saying, it was because the doctors like to have things efficient, quick, and scheduled so that they can go in, do their thing, and then go onto the golf course. Not joking, that's what people have been saying. And so it's about making it completely clinical and not, at all natural whatsoever. So I don't know if you heard any of those kinds of stories either.
Yes, and so, I mean, it's interesting. There are a lot of underlying reasons within, like, the public health system in Mexico, and then also, like, within private practice. Some of it does have to do with those issues of efficiency. What I was hearing a lot expressed was that that it wasn't, the experience was not about the woman or listening to the experiences or, kind of having that, because it's interesting because like you need like a certain amount of like medicalization and like C-sections and like different things, but at the same time, like, the WHO has identified, like C-section rates that are like above a certain rate. There's something going on like in your public health system where you're not having a woman and child-centered experience. And so that's would be what I would say the feedback that I was hearing from the women I was talking to.
Right. So another question that I have is about like men in the delivery rooms, because I know that like men are not allowed to be in the delivery rooms in Mexico. Is that correct? Like in the public hospitals or private hospitals?
I actually don't know. I think that it's interesting because there's been sort of like generational shifts. And so I think like in this movement, like towards like what they're calling like the humanized birth, I think they're also looking into those experiences. And so it was interesting because even among some of the most traditional people, it was like, oh yes, the father is there to like cut the cord. And I found that very fascinating because that seemed very, very different than sort of like a traditional, like, the man is not in the delivery room.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to interrupt Tina for a moment just to see if there are other questions. Tina will keep going if none of you want to step up. So, but yes, Arnoldo, please.
Doctor Janzen, ¿me apoya para la pregunta, por favor? Tengo una pregunta para la maestra Leidy. Ajá, sí. Escuchaba tu propuesta de investigación y miro que la haces desde las políticas públicas, el perfil de políticas públicas hacia una problemática local.
¿Es un problema qué?
Es un problema de políticas públicas hacia una situación local de las comunidades.
And so he's asking, he compliments her on her research and says, well, this is using public policy to study something that is really local.
Y mi pregunta es esta. Es un poco complicada quizás, pero creo que de eso se trata también, de reflexionar sobre algo muy, muy particular. ¿Usted no cree que a veces como investigadores tenemos una posición y esa posición nos lleva a mirar nuestro problema desde nuestra perspectiva? Sin embargo, en los trabajos de campo nos metemos dentro de las comunidades, pero seguimos estando outside, afuera un poco. Y creo que en los últimos tiempos, creo como maestro también, debemos de proponer unas nuevas propuestas para tratar de entender más a los actores que investigamos. Y me explico. Usted habló de lo público y lo privado. Y desde el punto de vista del investigador, lo público y lo privado, metodológicamente, es deducible. Pero desde el interior de la comunidad, lo público y lo privado es un problema muy, muy grande. Richard Sennett, Habermas, Mumford-Leuer, Barth, dicen ellos como sociólogos, que cuando una sociedad no plantea defender lo privado, que es familia, cuestiones internas, religión, lo público va a invadir la atmósfera y va a irse lo privado haciéndose menos, como fue lo que pasó con la esfera de la sociedad burguesa en el tránsito a la sociedad capitalista moderna. Entonces, desde esa perspectiva, como que la historia le da más la razón a las comunidades menonitas y a todas aquellas comunidades que defienden sus usos y sus costumbres. Y desde ese punto yo digo, ¿no valdría la pena plantear una sociología más comprensiva cuando nosotros estamos analizando algo?
Okay, I'm going to cut you off. And also summarize. I was taking notes because I'm a professor, not an interpreter. The question, and Leidy has her husband, I believe, is right there, so that should be okay for translating back. But about positionality and especially the relationship between the public and private spheres, and what happens when the public sphere starts to invade the private or domestic sphere. And he was giving examples from the change to a more modern or capitalist style of economy, but to think about how this framework could apply to her study. Ya.
Okay. Bueno, gracias. Es una pregunta importante. Tal vez quiero hacer una aclaración.
Thank you, and it's an important question, and I want to clarify something.
Y yo expliqué que mi investigación tiene 3 enfoques.
I explained that my investigation has 3 foci:
Género, interseccionalidad y poder.
gender, intersectionality, and power.
Y en el marco de esos 3 conceptos,
And in the framework of these 3 concepts,
y desde mi observación,
and from my observation,
las entrevistas que hice,
and from the interviews that I conducted,
expliqué también cuáles son las tradicionalmente para los menonitas. Expliqué específicamente con los Old Colony cómo hay una división de los roles.
and I explained that especially in the traditional Old Colony, there's a division of roles.
Y por eso mencioné cómo la división de los roles están en el ambiente público y también hay una división de roles en lo privado.
And the division of roles, there are divisions that are more public, in public roles, and then ones that are more in private roles.
Más que una crítica, es un análisis reflexivo de cómo estos roles tradicionales siguen teniendo una desventaja para las mujeres.
And not so much a criticism, but a reflection of how these different roles create a disadvantage for women.
And so we have time for one last question.
Yeah, I'm Royden Lowen. My question is for Doreen. Doreen, I sensed in your paper a theme of the subversive Mennonite woman in a way I didn't see in the other three. And I'm wondering whether you, as sort of the senior scholar in this panel, would be willing to comment on whether you see the same agency in the women in the other three papers that we heard, and whether your particular methodology would bring out greater degrees of agency than we might have seen otherwise.
Interesting question, because I'm actually going to use the example of one of your relatives to respond to that. I see a lot more agency among the women I interviewed than what I'm hearing in these papers. But your cousin's wife in Spanish Lookout and I were chatting, and we were talking about how women had adjusted their clothing style to the changing climate when they moved from Mexico to Belize, where it was a lot hotter and more humid. And she said, well, we just, one Sunday we all came to church with kerchiefs that had fringes, but the next Sunday, all the women came to church with a kerchief without fringes. Nobody said anything. We don't know how that decision was made. But I think there is that underground network that women use to empower each other and themselves. And certainly one of the places where I did a homestay, it was very obvious that the wife had been involved in the husband's change of profession, in decisions about what farm machinery to purchase in Mexico. I think women aren't really as silent as we sometimes make them out to be, but they may have different ways of communicating their agency than the men do. Certainly quite different from the cultural roles that are available to men.
Thank you for that response, Doreen, and let us congratulate the panel on a sort of thought-provoking discussion about gender and foodways.